like to start up then by continuing talking about the special VFR clearance. Now, I'd like to mention that the special VFR clearance is also available for aircraft that want to depart. If you want to depart, and if the weather is less than a 1,000-foot ceiling, when you call for your clearance, they'll tell you again the control zone is IFR, and then your job is to ask for a special VFR clearance. Now, what they'll do is they'll check and be sure there's no IFR aircraft that are inbound. Now, let me mention to you that when they check for this, I'd like you to know that, you see, IFR planes are controlled en route by someone called the center, the IFR center. In this particular area, the IFR center of jurisdiction is called the Denver Center. The Denver Air Route Traffic Control Center covers this area. So whenever you were coming in and you asked for a special VFR, they very likely got on the phone. They have a special phone with no dial on it. They pick it up and it rings automatically in the Denver Center, and they're checking to see if there's any IFRs inbound. And if there are no IFRs, then they'll issue your special VFR. Now, class, here's one thing that's important to know. Listen to this very carefully. When you get a special VFR clearance, they'll say to you, all right, you're cleared into the control zone to maintain special VFR conditions. What does that mean? When you maintain special VFR conditions, that means this airport is now like all the other airports as far as weather minimums go. What were the weather minimums at all other airports?
1 mile visibility.
1 mile visibility and clear of clouds. So when you get a special VFR clearance, they've said there are no airliners coming in here. There are no IFR planes, so you can now come in and your minimums are now the same as they are for all other airports. Because the purpose of the control zone, you see, class, is to protect the airplanes operating under instrument flight rules. That's the purpose of the control zone. Now, by the way, there are some airports that do not allow special VFRs at all. You can tell that because they have a bunch of little T's around them instead of dashes. Now, why would they ever have that? Well, the reason is simple. What would you think would happen if you wanted to get into O'Hare? You called up O'Hare Tower and told them you're over at Arlington Park landing. They'd tell you, Roger, you're number 444 to enter the control zone. Expect your clearance in 4 hours. So when you get a real busy airport, and there aren't many of them in the United States, but when you get a real busy airport, they don't even allow special VFR clearances. Now you might say, well, why is it I haven't come across this before? I haven't heard of this before. You might be flying solo cross country. I've run into many student pilots that don't know what a special VFR clearance is. The reason is because, you see, right now, your instructors are overly cautious about you when you go out on a cross-country flight. They're concerned that the weather's going to get bad. They might not let you take a cross-country flight if the weather's less than 5,000-foot ceiling and 10 miles visibility. Some instructors won't let you go if there's a whole cloud and anywhere in the Midwest, all right? You might think your instructor's like that. But they're very protective of you. So it's unlikely as a student pilot you're going to have to get a special VFR clearance for anything. However, as soon as you get your private license, now it's a whole new ballgame. You're the one making the decision. If you own the airplane, especially, it's your decision. But if you rent a plane, sometimes they're even protective of you when you depart and you're renting a plane. But now you're out somewhere for 3 days and you're coming back. Now it's your decision to make when you want to stop at some city along the way, and all of a sudden they tell you that the control zone is IFR. What are your intentions? You've got to know about a special VFR clearance. So special VFRs only apply when the weather's less than 1,003. Now, one thing I'd like to mention to you is this. Here's an area of confusion. And this is an area where people get FAA violations. I'd like to tell you, class, FAA violations are very serious. Anytime, if you're interested in aviation as a career, they always ask on all applications, have you ever received an FAA violation? And I don't care if you only had 25 hours when you got your FAA violation, you've got to put down in there, yes, you had an FAA violation. It also affects your insurance, because people don't get FAA violations very often. It's not like traffic tickets where you might get 2 a year or something like that. Here's an airport where you can get in trouble very quickly. This is at Chadron, Nebraska. Now you've got Rapid City there. Let's go down about 15 inches down from Chadron, or from Rapid City to Chadron. Now you notice something about Chadron that's interesting. This airport has a control zone, but it has no tower. Now, I'd like to tell you that any airport, well, only airports with a tower really require you to use your radio. You could fly right into Chadron and not even use your radio. That would be okay, all right? So if you had a nice day, a clear day, and you went into Chadron, Nebraska, you wouldn't even have to use your radio. However, class, what are your weather minimums at this airport? 1,000-foot ceiling and 3 miles visibility. These are your weather minimums at Chadron. So if you were to land there, and sometimes this happens, I've seen this happen many, many times. Sometimes you're taking across country, it's a nice day, the sun is shining, but there's a low haze down on the ground. You can see the airport 15 miles away, but as you descend into the haze, it's a little harder to see. That airport, even though you're looking at it 15 miles away on sort of a slant visibility, looking at the airport 15 miles away, that weather observer there, who happens to be with the FAA, he's a flight service station person, that weather observer there might be observing 2.5 miles visibility in haze. And if you fly into this airport without using your radio and you land, you'll find that this FAA guy is going to come out and he's going to want to know your name and your address and all that. And I can tell you that you will probably get a certified letter from the FAA, from the administrator. Now, the administrator is either the person in Washington, D.C., or anyone designated that he may designate becomes the administrator. They'll send you a letter saying, we are investigating an incident that occurred on June 15th, of which you were the pilot in command of so-and-so airplane. It is believed that you may have been in violation of 91.9. This is a regulation that says you cannot operate careless and recklessly. And it'll also say that you violated the airspace rules because you landed at a control zone with less than 3 miles visibility. They've got the goods on you. And you can respond by letter and explain why this happened. But if you try to tell them, well, I only made a 70 on my written test and I missed that one, they're not going to buy that. Out in the real world, class, you must make a 100. Not only for safety, but for regulations. You must make a 100. And anytime you see an airport with a control zone, I want you to know that you have to have 3 miles visibility there. And if you don't have 3 miles visibility, you're going to have to get a special VFR clearance. Now you might say, well, who am I going to get that clearance from? Let me tell you the answer to that always. You get your special VFR clearance from the closest FAA facility. Now, who's the closest FAA facility here at Chadron, Nebraska? The Flight Service. We know I said that they work for the FAA. They are FAA people. Now I'm going to tell you a little later how to communicate with Flight Service. However, the number's frequency is right here, 123.6. You could call them and say, I'm 10 miles north, inbound for landing. What's your present airport advisory? And they'd say, well, presently, sir, the weather is clear, but visibility 2.5 miles. In haze. The control zone is under IFR, sir. And then you would say, Roger, I'd like a special VFR clearance. They'll pick up that phone with no dial on it. They'll talk to the controlling IFR center, the Denver center in this case. They'll check and be sure there's no IFRs inbound, and then they'll issue you a special VFR clearance. Very simple. But anyway, you get your special VFR from the closest FAA facility. Now, the reason I say this is a place where you can easily get an FAA violation is because they don't necessarily educate you here unless you ask for it. Now, a place like Rapid City, you see, where there is an airport traffic area and a control zone co-located, you've got to call the tower already. So the tower says, hey, you need a special VFR clearance. So they educate you on the spot. But a place like Chadron, you may not even call because it's not required to call. There are people that just fly right on in there and don't even call anyone. And I want you to know that you might get an FAA violation in this case. Okay? But you can always find out what the weather is by calling the closest FAA facility. Now, by the way, I want to mention another thing. This airport has a Unicom here on 123.0. That's the Unicom frequency here. You might call the Unicom and say, I'm 10 miles north, inbound for landing. What's your weather? He might say, well, looked pretty good to me. I found the airport. I drove here, you know. They're not air traffic controllers. We're going to learn a little later that when you land at an airport with a flight service, you always call the flight service for airport advisory rather than the Unicom if you're going to call someone. We'll talk about that later. But now, yes, sir?
Is that control zone in Chadron only operating under certain hours? Is there a little notice there?
It probably is. That's correct. It says here, see NOTAMs, or the airport directory for control zone effective hours. It might not operate after 10 o'clock at night. This might be a part-time control zone because it's a part-time flight service. Remember, there must be a weather observer on duty. If the weather observer goes home at 10 o'clock, the control zone would be in effect, would go out of effect. Okay, now let me show you another one where you can get another FAA violation very easily. See, you've got to watch out for all these. This is not on your map, but this is Manitowoc, Wisconsin. Notice that Manitowoc, Wisconsin has a control zone, so the weather minimums here are 1,000-foot ceiling and 3 miles visibility. Now here's an airport over here, New Holstein, just a little bit of ways from it, but this airport is only a mile visibility and clear clouds. But this airport, just because it has a control zone around it, the blue dashed line means they have to have 1,003. And what that means to you is that if the weather's less than 3 miles visibility, you're going to have to get a special VFR. Now, who are you going to get it from here? There's no flight service there. There's no tower there. Who do you think you'd call for a special VFR here?
Closest one.
The closest one, which happens to be Green Bay, Wisconsin. You'd probably call Green Bay Flight Service. And you'd say, now if you didn't know what the weather was, how would you find out the weather? Would you call the Unicom and ask them what the weather is? No, they don't have the FAA's telecommunication system at their access. So you would call the flight service at Green Bay and say, sir, I'm VFR into Manitowoc. Looks a little hazy down there, sir. Could you tell me what their present weather is? Well, sir, on their last hour, their report showed that they had clear but visibility 2 miles in ground fog. And then you'd say, Roger, sir, would you please get me a special VFR clearance? Roger, sir, we'll put you on request for a special VFR. So remember, you have to call the FAA to find out about the weather, the official weather. You might call the Unicom and say, I'm 15 south inbound for landing. They might say, we have no reported traffic, and that's it. See, the Unicom people are not air traffic controllers.
How do you know, call Green Bay by just looking?
Okay, you look for the closest FAA facility. You might look for the closest flight service, the flight service that serves the area. We'll learn a little later. Here it shows Manitowoc VOR has voice capability. Green Bay has voice capability over Manitowoc VOR. That does happen to be the closest, but you call the closest FAA facility. Now this is unusual we come into situations like this, but it happens. See, when you come to an airport, even though it has a control zone, I want you to know you have to have a 1,000-foot ceiling and 3 miles visibility, or you have to get a special VFR clearance. Any questions on that? Yes, sir.
The part I'm confused about, when you have the dotted lines which indicates a control zone, you're recommending that before you go in there to land, call that FSS?
I'm recommending that if you have any doubt, all right, about the weather. Now, if you're on a day when you know that it's clear, I mean, you just know it's good. You know they've got 3 miles visibility. In that case, I would just call the Unicom as you always do, as we'll talk about later. I would call the Unicom as always, say I'm 10 south, inbound for landing, what's your winds and traffic, and so on, all right? That's what I would do. But if I thought that there was any doubt in my mind that they may have less than 3 miles visibility, I would call the FAA, some FAA facility, and say, what is the latest weather observation you have for Manitowoc? And if he says, oh, they were IFR all morning, but now they're up to 1,003. You say, Roger, thank you very much. Now you can go back to talking to Unicom as you would normally do. But if they say the weather is 1,000 overcast and 2.5 miles visibility in haze, your next words are, I'm requesting a special VFR clearance. Okay? Now I'd like to tell you that the person that's taking the weather observation, or you might wonder, who is it taking the observation? And why do they have a control zone there? There's probably some scheduled air taxi that goes in there. And to protect the public, they have the control zone to protect them. But they don't have enough traffic to warrant a control tower there. And they don't even, and there's already a flight service station at Green Bay, so they're not going to build another flight service station. But you might say, well, who's taking the weather observations? They must have a weather observer, right? The weather observer class is probably a person that works for the airline. He's probably a designated ticket taker, bag smasher, and weather observer. All right? He sort of wears several hats there. All right? He takes your ticket, smashes your bag, and makes observations. All right? And he sends these into the FAA hourly or as the weather changes. That's how they get in the FAA telecommunication system. Okay? Any questions on that? All righty. Now, I'd like to take a minute to mention one other thing that's important that will surely be on the test, and that is special VFR clearances at night. I want you to put this in your notes here. Let's go to Fact 2 of our fact sheet. I want you to write beneath Fact 2, special VFR clearances are not allowed at night unless you have an instrument rating and you're instrument equipped. Okay, no special VFRs at night unless you're instrument rated and instrument equipped. Now let me explain this to you for a minute. Class, the reasons for this is a sort of a new rule. New rule means it's been around for only 10 years. The reason for this is that when the visibility gets less than 3 miles, it's difficult to maintain any concept of where the horizon is. And it's very possible that you'll get disoriented and have an accident. So there have been a lot of accidents at night. It's very dangerous to fly around any time the visibility is less than 3 miles, but especially at night. So that's why there are no special VFRs allowed at night. But I'd like to get ahead just a bit in the course and talk about clearances and what they really mean. An air traffic control clearance is for the purpose of separating known traffic. And it is not an authorization to break any rule or regulation. Now, what I mean is this. If you call Rapid City Tower, and you say, Rapid City, say it's night, you say, Rapid City Tower, this is Bonanza 8, Mike Whiskey, I'm over Mount Rushmore Landing. and they say the weather's 800 overcast, 2 miles, light rain and fog, you say, Roger, get me a special VFR, he's not going to say, do you have an instrument rating, sir? Are you instrument equipped? He'll say, Roger, sir, I'll put your clearance on request. And he will probably issue you a special VFR, and he'll never inquire as to whether you had an instrument rating. What I want you to understand, this is extremely important, class. I want you to understand that an air traffic control clearance is not an authorization to break any rule or regulation or to conduct any unsafe flight. It is not a clearance. For instance, if you called called ground control and said, I'm on the ramp taxi for takeoff and I forgot my medical and license today, because all right if I go flying. I might say, hey, it's all right with me, man. You know, in other words, his job is to separate traffic. His job is not to keep you in compliance with the rules or to give you, to say, well, some people say, well, he cleared me to do it. He cleared me for a special VFR. See? Even if you say, I have no instrument rating, is it all right? He might say, hey, it's all right with me. He doesn't have to know those rules. He just says, hey, there's no planes. You want a special VFR? You got it, man. See? So I want you to understand that special VFRs are not allowed at night, and if you get one and you have no instrument rating, you're in violation. All right, in summary now, let's summarize the control zone business here. It says, the boundaries under control zone, fact 2 or fact sheet. The boundaries are shown on the map by a broken blue line. Underline the next sentence. This is the important thing I want you to know. This is for your instructor, this is for your examiner, this is for your oral, this is for your biennial flight reviews, and that is that it requires a ceiling of 1,000 feet and a visibility of 3 miles for VFR operations beneath the ceiling. Okay, and then again, you don't need to underline this part, but it says, when the weather is less than VFR, a special VFR clearance may be obtained for aircraft desiring to enter or leave the control zone. And it says minimum for a special VFR clearance is 1 mile visibility and clear of the clouds. And it says that a control zone airport may or may not have a control tower. All right, we just talked about that. Now, on that sentence you underline, there's one key word I want you to circle. It's very important, and that is the word beneath. All right, that's the key word where there's a lot of confusion. You only need a 1,000-foot ceiling and 3 miles visibility in a control zone if you're going to be beneath the ceiling. We're going to learn in just a little while, class. We're going to learn, just like you see on page 22 there, the picture on page 22, you can see a control zone goes up very high. It goes up higher than you fly. It actually goes up to 14,500 feet. That's how high it goes. So we can't fly over it. But there is no requirement to fly up at 8,000 feet that you have a 1,000-foot ceiling. The 1,000-foot ceiling only applies if you're going to be beneath the ceiling. You could go over to Palwaukee Airport and have lunch and talk to most of the private pilots over there, and they wouldn't understand that. There's a lot of confusion about that. The 1,000-foot ceiling only applies if you're beneath the ceiling. Okay? That's when you have to have a 1,000-foot ceiling, if you'll be beneath the ceiling. Okay, continuing on with the legend. On the legend, we come down here in the legend, we come down to where it talks about obstructions. I want to take a minute to talk about obstructions here, and I want to point out to you that this shows some obstructions, the symbols for obstructions on the legend. This is also on your back of your book, page 79, but in your legend, you might want to get that out now. And I want to point out to you, just to the east of Rapid City, we see an obstruction here, and this obstruction is 3,463 feet above sea level. However, it's only 243 feet above ground. So the number in parentheses is the height of it above ground. The other number is the height of the obstruction above sea level. It's important that when you look at this, you think, well, this is a tremendous obstruction. But the fact of the matter is, this is a relatively small obstruction. It's only 243 feet above the ground. Now, anytime the obstruction is more than 1,000 feet above the ground, the legend shows us that the obstruction will be shown in rather bold ink. All right? It's shown rather bold if it's more than 1,000 feet above the ground. You can also see, they'll ask you a question on the test, how do you know if it has high-intensity lights on it? Well, you can tell it has little bolts of lightning on it. That tells us it has those little bolts of lightning tells it has high-intensity lights. All right. I want to talk to you about something else here. I'd like you to look here on the legend, and the legend shows us a symbol for variation, if there's any magnetic variation. I'd like to point out that here we have 12 degrees of magnetic variation shown. 12 degrees east of magnetic variation. These are called the isogonic lines. We're going to use these when it comes to navigating. And I want to mention that this little miniature airplane is pointing at straight, true north right now. It's lined up with the lines of longitude. But the magnetic North Pole is offset 12 degrees to the right, or to the east here. So we have 12 degrees of variation. Your map might be slightly different. Some of them changed a little bit. About 12 degrees of easterly variation here. We're going to use this correction whenever we do some navigating a little later on in the course. But I want you to be able to know that this shows how much magnetic variation there is in the area. Here's another one that shows 12 degrees 30 minutes. Now 11 degrees 30 minutes. That's 11 and a half degrees. There's 60 minutes in a degree, so therefore 11 degrees 30 minutes is 11 and a half degrees of variation. You might say, why is this? Take a look up here. Here we have a map of the United States. You can see that here is the true North Pole. This is the geographic North Pole. Here is the magnetic North Pole. If you're in an airplane and you're over here, over by Rapid City, here we were at Rapid City, you can see here that out by Rapid City, the airplane is lined up with the magnetic North Pole. But that puts it to the east of the true North Pole. Sometimes you're in the middle of the country, around the Midwest, and the true North Pole and the magnetic North Pole coincidentally line up. Here's another chart that shows us, this shows us the whole United States, the variation across the whole United States. You can see that out in the western states we have as much as 20 degrees of easterly variation. And in the central part of the country, through the Midwest, we have sometimes zero variation. In the Chicago area, there's zero variation. And in the East Coast, they have maybe 20 degrees of westerly variation. Okay, I mentioned to you about a rotating beacon. All right, this just shows us on the legend the rotating beacon symbol. We already talked about that. But one thing I want to point out at this time, class, take a look up here. Here's a picture of the beacon. You know that the beacon is on at night to help us find the airport. But they're going to ask a question on the test, and they're going to say, what does it mean if the beacon is on in the daytime? And I want you to know, this is on the test, if the beacon is on in the daytime, that means that the weather is below basic VFR. It's below 1003. Now, of course, if this is on in a control zone, that's a signal to you to say, don't bother calling the tower asking for taxi instructions for VFR flights unless you want to get a special VFR. It's just sort of a way of signaling you to tell you that the weather is below 1003. As soon as the beacon is off, then you can call the tower and you can assume the weather's better than 1003. Now, sometimes they might have this on at an airport without a control zone that's just telling you the weather's less than 1003. That's sort of the operator's best guess. It just means when the weather's less than 1003, the beacon is on, and if it's a control zone, that means you're going to have to get a special VFR if you want to fly under visual conditions that day. Oh, okay. Now, class, I want to talk to you about something else. I'd like you to come over here under airspace information, and you can see here that it shows an airway. This is a Victor airway. We have a Victor airway running south of Rapid City here. Here's a Victor airway, and it says on it 176 degrees, and it also says on it Victor 169. This is sort of a highway in the sky. Now, IFR airplanes, instrument airplanes, they fly on these airways. Visual pilots can fly on them if they want. You can share the airways with them. But you don't have to fly on these airways. You can fly off airways all you want. Why do they put these airways on the map? The reason they put these on the map is to let you know where there's a lot of traffic. In other words, class, if you wanted to go out and do steep turns, stalls, slow flight, spins, it'd be a lot better to practice it over here than it would be right here. All right? This is, in fact, it's illegal to do aerobatic maneuvers on airways. So that's the reason they put these on here, just so you'll know where there's a lot of traffic. Oh, okay. This airway says on it 176 degrees. That's a navigational setting for setting up your equipment so you can stay on that airway. The name of this airway, though, is Victor 169. It's not Victor 176. That's just the setting of your navigational equipment. The name of the airway is Victor 169. Now, class, I want to talk to you about something that's an extremely important concept. Take a look up here. This shows something here where it shows some magenta and blue tints. It says the limits of controlled airspace are shown by tint bands and are color-coded blue and magenta, whatever that means. Let me talk to you about what that means. What I'd like you to do, class, is take a look up here. And I'd like to have you look around Rapid City. And I'd like you to notice that around Rapid City, it's tinted sort of a magenta color. There's sort of a large keyhole-looking area there that's tinted sort of a magenta color. And as you look beyond that, you can see that it's tinted sort of a blue color out here. Now what this means is, it's telling us the floor of the controlled airspace. In the blue tinted area, the floor of the controlled airspace is 1,200 feet above the ground. In the magenta tinted area, the floor of the controlled airspace is 700 feet above the ground. Now class, here's an example of airspace that's not, of the map that's not tinted at all. So you might say, what do you mean this isn't tinted? But it is tinted, class. Take a look up here. Look at here. You can open your maps to Rapid City if you don't have them open to that. Here's Rapid City. Right here, you can see that it has sort of a sharp edge. It has no tinting to it at all. I call this elsewhere. See, we've got the red tint, we got the blue tint, and we got elsewhere. Elsewhere means there is no controlled airspace at all. You're probably saying, well, what is controlled airspace? Let's take a look here at our fact sheet. Let's look at our fact sheet to where it says controlled airspace. And let's see what it says. This is sort of my definition for the purpose of this class. Basically, in the simplest of terms, controlled airspace is areas where IFR planes operate. IFR planes operate in controlled airspace. Now, by the name controlled airspace, it sounds, class, what does that sound like? That sounds like a place you can't go. Or it sounds like a place where you've got to get a clearance to go up there. No, that's not the way the rules work. Let me tell you, class, let me have your attention, let me tell you this. If you want to go up in controlled airspace, where the IFR planes operate, it's on the honor system. You have to say, on my honor, I promise, if I go up there where IFR airplanes are, where airliners are full of people, I promise I'll maintain 3 miles visibility so I can see and avoid airliners. Plus, I'll maintain a reasonable distance from clouds. The actual rule we'll learn about later is 500 feet below, 1,000 above, and 2,000 feet horizontally from clouds. That's what you have to do. On your honor, you have to maintain that. So now, class, I told you that in the blue tinted area, right here, the floor of the controlled airspace is 1,200 feet above the ground. Here, the floor of the controlled airspace is 700 feet above the ground. So if I take off from, here's a little airport here in the middle here called Custer County Airport. If I take off from this airport, if I want to go up into controlled airspace, do I have to call for a radio clearance to go up in controlled airspace with those IFR airplanes? No. All I've got to do, class, when I get above 1,200 feet is determine to myself, on my honor, do I have 3 miles visibility? And can I stay far enough away from a cloud that if an airliner or an IFR plane were to pop out of that cloud, that I'd be able to see and avoid that airliner? It's on my honor. There's no Goodyear blimp floating around saying, there's a guy, I see him, he's only got 2 miles visibility, we got him on radar, get him. That doesn't happen, all right? It's on your honor, all right? Now, you might get up there and the weather might be good. You might have 5 miles visibility, but as you're flying along, all of a sudden it starts raining. And you decide, hey, you know what? I don't have 3 miles visibility anymore. I've only got 2.5 miles visibility. Well, you're illegal. You don't need to get on the radio and say, I'm illegal, come get me, all right? But what you got to do is you better solve the situation quickly, because pretty soon you're endangering the life of airliners, endangering the life of yourself. What you have to do is get out of their way. What you have to do now is get to the uncontrolled airspace. If you were flying along up here at 6,500 feet and you wanted to get down to uncontrolled airspace, what would you have to do? Descend below 1,200 feet. Now, it's hard to tell when you're less than 1,200 feet. If the ground is real flat, you can kind of figure what the ground elevation is. But sometimes you don't know what the elevation is. All you got to do is get down real low. When you're down real low and you can see the ground quite clearly and you know you're low, you guess you're less than 1,200 feet, that's good enough. Because when you're down low, you say, nobody else is this low, you're low enough, all right? Because we don't have radio altimeters in the airplane, see? We don't have a way of knowing our exact height above the ground. We can sort of estimate, assuming we know the elevation of the ground, but we can't tell exactly. All right, now class, I'd like to talk a little bit more about this. I'd like to tell you that I've told you the floor of the controlled airspace here. What is the floor of the controlled airspace here? 1,200. What is it here? 1,200. What is it here? 1,200. What is it here? It doesn't exist. There is no controlled airspace here. There are no IFR planes in there, in other words. You can fly around there with only a mile visibility, no matter how high you are, just about. What's the floor of the controlled airspace here? 700. Now I'd like to tell you something else. In the control zone, the floor of the controlled airspace is the ground. All right? Take just a second to turn to page 22 again. Just a second to look at page 22. We'll just be there for a second. Page 22, the very first sentence under control zone says, a control zone, on page 22, the very first sentence says, controlled airspace which extends upward from the surface. So this is the only place where controlled airspace goes all the way to the surface. All right? So now, class, I'm going to point around the map and I want you to tell me the floor of the controlled airspace. What's the floor of the controlled airspace here? 1,200. What is it here? 1,200. What is it here? 700. And what is it here? The surface. What is it here? Surface. What is it here? Surface. That's right. So controlled airspace goes all the way to the surface. And what's the price of admission into controlled airspace? 3 miles visibility, and you got to keep that cloud separation we were talking about. Now, one more thing I didn't mention, though, and I want to mention right now. You see this out here? There's always an exception. Everything's nice and orderly like we just talked about, but here's the exception. Right here it shows a number that says 9,000 MSL. What that means is that the floor of the controlled airspace here is stated in terms of MSL rather than above ground level. The floor of the controlled airspace here is 9,000 feet MSL. The floor of the controlled airspace here is 1,200 AGL. All right? Now you might have to convert the AGL, the above ground level, to MSL by knowing the ground elevation here, but here it's just a blanket 9,000. Now you might say to yourself this, you might say, Your Airworthiness, what do you mean? This is blue and that's blue. How can you tell the difference? Well, look at here, class. Look at how there's a blue line here, and it's separating that this blue is different than this kind of blue. See? Otherwise it would just fade straight through here, blue. But they've got a little blue line here telling you this blue is different than that blue, and you look out and you see a label on it, 9,000. That means the floor of the controlled airspace there is 9,000 feet MSL. Okay, any question on that? Turn to page 1 in your supplemental data. I want you to look at this picture right here. Let's turn the chart sideways and let me get you oriented on this chart first. All right, first of all, you notice that we have, I want you to circle, this is page 1 in your supplemental data book, your yellow book. Your yellow book, page 1 in your yellow book. Page 1 in your yellow book says on it, uncontrolled airspace, and I want you to circle that. Circle that where it says uncontrolled airspace. It also says controlled airspace. I want you to circle that. Circle where it says uncontrolled and controlled. And I want you to see the separation of these two. The separation occurs on the red area. Now yours just says red. I can't print red there, so I just wrote red. I've drawn it here with a red magic marker. But the floor of the controlled airspace is 700 feet in the red tinted area, and the floor is 1,200 feet in the blue tinted area. And you can see the separation of these two. So you can see that here in controlled airspace, the floor is 1,200, and here the floor is 700 in the red tinted area, and you notice that in the control zone, the floor is the bottom of the control zone itself. Okay, now I'm going to circle for you in the next slide the price of admission to all these areas. And every area I have circled in the next slide is on your test. You might get asked any one of these areas. But these are things you must know for your oral exam. All right? These are things your FAA examiner will ask you on your oral test. Your FAA examiner, his job is to see if you understand this. And there's probably more people fail on this one point than any one thing. Okay, let's see why don't you circle all of these and we'll talk about these. Okay. Notice what I said before. If you're down in these areas without a control zone, at an airport without a control zone, you must be at an airport down here. Notice that the price to take off is only 1 mile visibility and clear clouds. We talked about that earlier. But you see, if you want to take off from that airport and you want to go up into controlled airspace, now the price of admission is 3 miles visibility, 500 below, 1,000 above, and 2,000 feet horizontally from the clouds. Now, one more thing that isn't circled, but I ought to talk about with you, and that's this. I already mentioned this, though. Notice that it says 1,000 foot ceiling minimum. That's the price of admission for the control zone, but what was the one requirement I put on that, and that is only if you're beneath the ceiling. If you're beneath the ceiling, you have to have a 1,000 foot ceiling and 3 miles visibility. If you're beneath the ceiling. Now what does that mean? Well, it means that beneath the ceiling we still have to have 3 miles visibility for sure, and we got to have cloud separation, 500 feet below, 1,000 above, 2,000 horizontally. But if we have a ceiling, if we have less than 1,000 foot ceiling, we're going to have to get a special VFR clearance, or if we have less than 3 miles visibility, we're going to have to get a special VFR clearance. Now, let me talk about operationally what this means. Take a look up here. Suppose you're cruising along up here and you're at 8,500 feet. What are our weather minimums? Well, somebody like to tell me, what do you think your weather minimums are up here at 8,500 feet? Could I ask you to volunteer?
What do you have to be above the clouds?
Yeah, what are your weather minimums? Your VFR minimums at 8,500 feet right here.
1,000 feet above the clouds.
1,000 feet above the clouds. What else?
Down to 2,000 on either side.
2,000 horizontally on either side, and 500 below. What else do you have to have?
3 mile visibility.
3 miles visibility. This is what we have to be VFR here. Now tell me this. Suppose you're flying along and you see beneath you clouds. It's all undercast beneath you. Now, it would be unsafe to proceed on if it's totally undercast beneath us because we're not sure we can get down without an instrument rating. But suppose we see an area where it's just cloudy for about a 10-mile area over a river valley area. Are we allowed to fly on top of clouds? Sure, as long as you're 1,000 feet above the clouds. Oh, legally, you could go for hundreds of miles on top, but it would be unsafe. Right? But for a short distance, surely you can go up there. So as long as we're 1,000 feet above the clouds, we can go over clouds. So our VFR minimums up here at, say, 8,500 feet or any altitude in here is 3 miles visibility, 500 below, 1,000 above, and 2,000 horizontally. Now, let's go over here and let's say we're in the control zone at 8,500 feet. What are your weather minimums up here in the control zone at 8,500 feet? Are they any different than they are over here? And the answer is they're no different at all. We still need just 3 miles visibility, 500 below, 1,000 above, and 2,000 horizontally. But what if this airport, what if this is a control zone and we heard an airplane coming in and we were monitoring the tower frequency and we heard him saying to another airplane that the weather is 800 overcast, 2 miles visibility in the control zone, and he said the control zone is IFR. And you know that the control zone actually goes up here to 14,500 feet. Does that mean you can't go through there? The answer is you can still go through there. Because what was the key word I had you underline there in fact 2? Beneath the ceiling. In other words, that 1,000-foot ceiling only applies to aircraft beneath the ceiling. And as long as you're up here, as long as you're 1,000 feet above the clouds, that doesn't apply to you. Sometimes a controller's looking at a dingy, dark day with rain and everything else. They might think that you've got to have, they might sort of think, well, it must be overcast up there. They don't realize it's a beautiful sunny day up there at 8,500 feet. Now, if you want to fly over this airport like Rapid City then, at 8,500 feet, you wouldn't have to call anyone to fly through that control zone, even though the weather was IFR. But now if you wanted to go through less than 3,000 feet above the ground, since you'd be going through the airport traffic area we talked about, you'd have to call to go through the airport traffic area regardless of the weather. You'd have to call for that. But I just want you to understand that that 1,000-foot ceiling only applies to operations beneath the ceiling. Now, let's go up here to 10,000 feet. I'd like you to notice that at 10,000 feet, the minimums increase. So that we have to be 1,000 feet below clouds, 1,000 feet above, and 1 mile horizontally from the clouds. And you have to have 5 miles visibility. And we have to have 5 miles visibility. And you might say, well, why is it we have to have all this increased visibility and cloud separation 10,000 feet and above? And the reason is because jets, and all aircraft for that matter, are restricted to 250 knots, 10,000 feet and below, or below 10,000, right? So that means that 10,000 feet and above, they can go any speed they want, basically. That means they're traveling much faster up there. And because they're going much faster, it makes sense that the price of admission up there should be a little greater visibility, a little higher VFR minimums. Okay? All righty? Now, one thing that's confused a lot of times, this is not brought out on the test. On the test, they're just simply going to say to you, what's the price of admission here, here, or here? And they might ask you even over here, and that's marked here for you. You can study that. But one thing that's not brought out that you need to understand is this. You hear people say that basic VFR is a 1,000-foot ceiling and 3 miles visibility. I want you to understand that really technically only applies to operations at the control zone for taking off and landing. In other words, if we have a 700-foot ceiling and you want to fly a trip, if you're going to go a short distance and it's pretty good visibility beneath that, you're only going to go 20 miles or something and follow a road, for instance, you could legally do that. All right? You could legally fly along with 700-foot ceiling as long as you stayed beneath the clouds and kept a mile visibility. Now, as I've mentioned to you, I'm a professional pilot. I've been a professional pilot for over 20 years. Now, I wouldn't fly any cross countries with a 700-foot ceiling. Under certain circumstances, though, if I only wanted to go a short distance, 20 miles, along a route that I was particularly familiar with, knew was flat and there were no antennas, I might want to just get an airplane from one airport to another to get the radio fixed or something, I might do it in that case, and it would be legal, right? But generally speaking, you don't want to fly cross countries with much less than a 1,000-foot ceiling, but it is legal The only time the so-called basic VFR minimum of 1,003 really applies is whenever you want to take off or land at a control zone airport. Okay, all this brings us, with this picture here, brings us something I want you to know. I want you to know some terms. We have to know some terms. All these points I have circled here, 4 areas I want you to know about for the test. Only one of these is important, but there's 4 of them I want you to know about. I want you to know what the positive control area is, the continental control area, control areas, and transition areas. I want you to know what these are. Okay, let me tell you this. There's only one of these that's important, and that's the positive control area. The positive control area class begins at 18,000 feet, and everything at 18,000 feet and above is under positive control, which means that everything is IFR. So I want you to know the price of admission to go 18,000 feet and above is you must be instrument rated and in an instrument equipped airplane. That's for starters. Okay? That's what you have to have. So that's an area, if you're out flying around without instrument rating, you cannot go above 18,000 feet or above. Now, there's another area they're going to ask you about on the test. This area is called the continental control area. It begins at 14,500 feet. Now, class, I have a question of you. This is sort of a trick question, but I'll ask it of you anyway. And I haven't tried to tell you any information about this, but some of you have a little background. Can anybody tell me, what do we have to do different to go up in the continental control area? What do we have to do if we're flying at 14,000 and we want to go to 15,000, or if we want to go up above 14.5 in the continental control area, what do we have to do different?
Oxygen.
No, there's no oxygen requirement. That begins at 12.5, 14, and 15, not 14.5.
Isn't the height the way you want to go?
The height and the way you want to go? No. The direction? No. No, doesn't apply here. Is there anything you have to do different? Do you have to have any equipment or any qualification? Is there any rules that are different?
Transponders?
Transponders? No, that begins at 12.5. Okay, the answer is nothing. Absolutely nothing. Knowing where the continental control area begins will only do one thing for you. It'll get you one more answer right on the FAA test. The continental control area doesn't mean a thing. There's no special clearances required to go up there. It means nothing. All right? They ask you how high does the control zone go, and the answer is it goes to the base of the continental control area, but that doesn't mean anything. So the continental control area means nothing. You might say, well, why do they have this? Well, there's a lot of things that don't have a good reason, and I'll tell you a lot of the reason why they don't have a good reason. There are a lot of things that are carryovers from the DC-6s, carryovers from the props. You see, years ago when they had DC-6s and 7s, the FAA thought there will never be anything more advanced than a DC-6 or 7. And they flew optimally above 14.5 up to about 20,000. That was an area where they flew a lot. So they wanted to make protection for that airspace. About the time they made the laws for that airspace, then they brought in the jets, and all the jets are up 30,000 and above. So they never renamed the continental controller. They had big plans. Probably they were going to require all kinds of special equipment and high visibility and all kinds of things to go in there. But that's never materialized. The fact is, you don't do anything different to go in the continental control area. Now the area below 14,500 is simply called control area. All right? And this little area down here is called a transition area. This area in the magenta tinted area, that area above that is called the transition area. Okay, just need to know that for the test, and we don't need to talk a whole lot about that. It's not very important. Of all of this up here, what's the only one that's important to you operationally? Positive control area. And that's because I want you to know you have to have a clearance to go in the positive control area. Alrighty, I want to now talk to you about some special use airspace. I want to talk to you about prohibited, restricted, warning, and alert areas. This is on your legend, all right? Now, let me tell you what I'm going to tell you. Here's what I'm going to tell you. I'm going to tell you that prohibited and restricted areas, you can see that marked on your legend, prohibited and restricted areas, you must stay out of those, except the restricted area, you can get a clearance to go in there. I'll say that again. Any area that's marked as prohibited or restricted, you must stay out of those areas unless you get a clearance. And you can't get a clearance through a prohibited area, don't even ask for it. But you can call flight service and you can ask for a clearance through a restricted area or the appropriate authority, might be a military airport, and they'll give you a clearance through a restricted area. Now, take a look up here. Just in summary, here's what I'm telling you. A prohibited area, stay out of it. A restricted area is invisible danger. You must call flight service for a clearance through the area because the area may be hot. Right? What this means is that there might be military training going on where they're practicing shooting down target airplanes. There's a target airplane called a drone, and it might have been a drone that's been released, and the military has competition as to who can shoot it down with the guided missiles. All right? Well, a drone is about the same size, a little smaller than a 152 Cessna. And sometimes in the heat of competition, they might inadvertently shoot you down. Now, let me tell you this. The military would never shoot you down as punishment. They would never say, I'm tired of those guys getting in this area, shoot them down. They would never do that. It would always be a mistake, all right? They'd write a nice letter to your family about how it was a mistake and they're sorry and all that, but you were in the wrong. You were in this restricted area, all right? So we can get a clearance through there if we want, though. We can call flight service and say, I'd like to go through restricted area so-and-so. And they'll say to you, Roger, it's Thanksgiving. And they're not shooting at anybody today, so you're cleared through there. Okay, so they may give you a clearance through there if you check and find out whether the area is hot. Now, prohibited areas, though, these are areas over, for instance, the White House in Washington, D.C. Don't ask for a clearance. They won't say, well, the president's not there today, so you can go through. All right, it's just hot all the time. Now, I want to talk to you about a warning area. A warning area, class, let me show you what these look like, by the way. Here's a restricted area. They're blue tinted like this. Here it says restricted area 7001. Don't bother looking for that. Okay? And here's a warning area. Now, warning areas, I want you to notice, there are none on the Cheyenne map because warning areas are always out over the ocean. Now, an important thing to understand about a warning area is these are just as dangerous as a restricted area. They're out over the water, though, and because they're beyond the territorial limits by treaty and airspace and international agreement, the FAA cannot give a person a violation for flying in a warning area. They might get shot down accidentally, but they can't give them a violation. So you see, the warning area is a little better deal than the restricted area. You might remember that in the restricted area, you got shot down, plus you get a FAA violation. All right? But in the warning area, it's a little better deal because all you do is get shot down here. You don't get a violation in this area, see? So that's a little better deal, so keep that in mind when you're going through a warning area. You can't get a violation, all right? All right, now, there's another area I want to mention to you, and that is I want to talk to you about a military operating area. Now, military operating areas are shown on the map in magenta color. I'll show you a picture of one right here. Now, they're kind of confusing. Not long ago, they didn't even mark these on the map. But one pilot was out flying around and he was run over by some jets that were out practicing dogfights. And there wasn't a restricted area because the FAA said, well, there's no invisible danger. These jets are visible. But they just didn't see them. They didn't see and avoid. But they said, well, gee, the AOPA, remember the AOPA, the Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association? Yeah. The AOPA said, well, gee, the guy, he got run over by a jet that was going 400 miles an hour in aerial combat with another plane, and they were playing games, and they ran him over. I said, we ought to know where you guys practice this, because when you're going 400 miles an hour with another guy on your tail trying to get away, you're not sort of looking around, hey, do you see any 152s out there, all right? It's not that kind of a flight. So they say, hey, we want to know, the public wants to know, the AOPA said the public wants to know where you do all this kind of jet training. And the military now puts on the map where the military operating areas are. And they say, if you want to fly through the area, that's okay, no violation, but maintain extra vigilance, because you might get run over by something you can see, all right? You can't get out of the way fast enough, all right? So this is a military operations area. There's no violation, and there is not invisible danger, but just maintain extra caution. Now, if you see any of these areas on your test, or in life, and on the test, I just mentioned to you that usually around the border of the map, for instance, if you took this map, don't bother turning to this, it'll just take time here. But if you looked on the map, you can find a little section on one of the panels here, and it talks about these areas. For instance, that area we just looked at was called the Edgemont Military Operations Area. And it said that the floor of this area, says that the floor of the area is 12,000 feet. The use of this is intermittent. Now, what's important to understand is this. They're trying to make this military operations area three-dimensional. Remember what I said, the floor of this is 12,000 feet. So on your test, they might say, if you were to fly through here at 10,000 feet, 10,500 for instance, they might say, which of the following is true? Would it be correct to say that you're flying through the MOA and should ask if the area is hot? No, you're beneath it. The floor is 12,000. You might as well be in Paducah, Kentucky as far as proximity to the MOA is concerned. The floor is 12,000 feet. Now, tell me this though, class. What if you want to fly through here at, for instance, 15,500? You wanted to fly through there. If you called flight service and said, "Sir, I'd like to fly through the Edgemont MOA. Is that area hot?" He said, "Yes, sir. That area is hot today." Could you say, "Well, I'm going to fly through there anyway"? Yes, you could. Could you get a violation for that? No. So that's the idea. This is sort of an advisory area. That's what you want to know. There's no violation for this. All right? So in summary, we got 3 kinds of areas I want you to know about. Restricted, actually 4. Prohibited areas, I don't have a slide for prohibited area, but prohibited areas like the White House, don't go through there. They're marked by P001. Restricted areas marked R, in this case 7001. All right? That's a restricted area. That's invisible danger and violations. Here's a warning area. That's invisible danger, but no violations because you're out over the ocean. And then there's the military operations areas. These are the areas where there's visible danger. And if you want to go through there, it might be dangerous, hazardous to your health to go through there. Okay? The alert area is, by the way, alert area, I don't see many of those anymore, but an alert area is just like a military operations area, in case you see an alert area. The rule is there's visible danger. There's a lot of military activity. Okay, I want to talk to you about VORs and talk to you about radio navigational aids. Here it says radio aids to navigation and communication. I'd like you to look at this on your legend page 79, or the actual legend on the map there. And I'd like to point out to you 4 types of navigational aids you're going to see and you should know about. Some of these, they don't ask you about the non-directional beacon, but you need to know about it. Take a look up here. There's 3 types of VORs you might see. There's a standard VOR shown as a hexagon. There's the VOR-TAC, that's a hexagon with little ears on it. And then there's a VOR-DME. There's also a non-directional beacon. 4 types of radio aids I want you to know about. Here's a regular NavCom radio. There's the communication side of the radio. There's the navigation side of the radio. There are certain stations we can tune in to navigate by. One of these is a VOR station. Another is the VOR-TAC. And the other is the VOR-DME, which I just showed you on the map legend. I'd like to tell you that all of these we can tune in and we can navigate to these. We can determine our position of these. These are our primary method of radio navigation in the United States. Now, I'd like to tell you that there's another radio called an ADF radio. It stands for Automatic Direction Finder. And we tune those in to stations called NDBs, non-directional beacons. Now, I'd like to tell you that what you should know, things that you should know, would be that the non-directional beacon is an older type of navigational aid. It's a low-frequency navigational aid. And because it's low frequency, it's affected a great deal by static. So it's not very good to navigate by, especially when you have bad weather in the area, thunderstorms or something like that. Now, another problem is that a non-directional beacon, if you have a real powerful one, it can be picked up for hundreds of miles away. And you might say, well, that's good. But that's not good. The problem is that a non-directional beacon, that there aren't enough frequencies to go around. And if you had all non-directional beacons were very, very powerful, they would interfere with each other. So how do they prevent one station from interfering with another? The answer is they're all very weak. The FCC only allows them to transmit to a very weak power. You can only pick these up for approximately 40 miles on a good day. Now, if you can only pick them up for and that means just simply be able to pick it up to tell you're tuned into the station, to navigate by it. If you can only pick it up for 40 miles on a good day, what do you think it's like on a day when there's thunderstorms around? You can barely navigate by it. That's why we had to get rid of this. This is not the primary method of navigation in this country. We can use this to home into airports. It's used to help us find airports. But the VORs, this is our primary method of navigation in this country. You see, class, the VORs are what we call very high frequency. Very high frequencies are line of sight. They don't get affected by any static. They're like FM radios. But the problem with VHF, very high frequency line of sight, is that if you're too low, you can't pick up the station. That's the only disadvantage of VHF. But the fact that it's so clear, so crisp, and so sharp, and if you have a powerful one, it won't interfere with another one because line of sight. If you're down to only, say, 10,000 feet, and if there's another one, but it's not for 400 miles away, the two beams will conflict with each other, but it might be up at 30,000 feet that the two beams from these VORs conflict with each other. So if we're down here, we can pick up station A, and we can navigate, no problem. Here's what the regular NavCom radio looks like. The left side is for your communication frequencies, which are also VHF frequencies, and the right side is for your navigational frequencies, where we tune in our VORs, our Vortex, and our VOR-DMEs. Now, let me tell you that if you see a station on the ground, you might say, well, why is it that a Vortex, what makes it different than a VOR or a VOR-DME? Let me tell you about that. Take a look up here, class. There's another radio that you may get. This radio is called DME, stands for Distance Measuring Equipment. And what I want you to know, class, is that only the Vortex or the VOR-DME can be used in a DME radio. Now, what a DME radio does is it tells you your distance from the station, all right? A DME radio tells you your distance from a station. Now, let's say that we have a VOR, such as Rapid City. Okay, now Rapid City is frequency 112.3. 112.3, so we dial that in here, 112.3. We can now navigate to that station. Because that station at Rapid City, let's look at that and someone tell me, can I use DME on that station? The answer is, yes we can, because it has ears around it. See, it has those 3 ears around it, which means that it is a Vortex. If it's a Vortex, and if we have a DME radio, we can tune it in our DME, 112.3, and it might tell us that we're, 67 nautical miles from that station. But you can only do that with a Vortex or a VOR-DME. Now, let me tell you that you might say, well, what's the difference between a Vortex or a VOR-DME? The answer is, as far as you're concerned, nothing. If you were a military pilot, you would find a difference on your military equipment. But to you, nothing. So any station that's a Vortex or a VOR-DME, we can get azimuth information from on our navigational radio, and we can get distance from on our DME equipment. Okay? Any questions on that? In summary, we have these 2 radios on page 61. We have the ADF radio, which is the automatic direction finder. On the ADF, we can use that to tune in non-directional beacons. They're sort of weak in power, though. And then we have the VHF radio. We use that to tune into VOR stations, and they're limited by line of sight.